Hi everyone, I'm Susie and welcome to my channel. In the previous video we learned about the fill stitch. This is the stitch that fills in the design. We created the embroidery file and stitched it out. If you'd like to know how to import the image you want to turn into an embroidery file, please check out part 1, which covers the fill stitch. In this video we're taking it a step further and learning about the satin stitch. We use this type of stitch when we want to add a border to a design, emphasize something, or for text and lettering. This is where we left off in the previous video. So this is the fill stitch, the one that fills the design with stitches. But what if we want the apple to have a border? This is called a satin stitch. The main difference to note is at the bottom, where it says fill. That's the fill colour. To get a satin stitch for the border, we don't use the fill, we use the stroke. The stroke is the outline. So, for the apple, I'll click on its name here, right click, and select duplicate. This places it on top. I'll hide the original one for now. Now we have the exact same red apple here. But as I mentioned, we don't need the fill this time, we need the stroke. I right click on fill and select remove fill. Now it disappears. However, I need to set the outer outline, the stroke, and give it a colour. I hold down the shift key and select red here. As you can see, the rectangle below changed, but the top one didn't. And this defines our outline. There's a panel here called Fill and Stroke. This is where we can adjust colours and line widths. If it doesn't appear here, go to Object, Fill and Stroke. We don't need fill, we need stroke, so we select the Stroke Style tab. Right now, this is a 1mm wide line. Let's decide how wide we want the apple's satin border to be. Let's say 1.5mm. Let's rename this one too. Let's call it Red Satin. I'll unhide the original layer so we can see it, but we can't see it clearly because it's the exact same colour as the apple. To make it visible, let's choose a darker shade by holding down the Shift key and selecting a darker colour. Now you can see the difference. So now we have our outline. To turn this into a satin border, we need to convert this line into a satin stitch. To do this, we go to Extensions, Ink Stitch, Tools, Satin, and select Stroke to Satin. The program does it automatically. If I zoom in on it, as you can see, it looks like a train track. This is always the requirement for a satin stitch. It always has to look like this. I'll rename it again because converting it created a brand new element, and I'll type red satin here. Now let's see how it will look. Go to Extensions, Ink Stitch, Params, as you can see, we can preview what the stitch will look like right here. The satin stitch has its own set of settings as well. The default stitch density for satin stitch is 0.4, which is usually fine as it is. If you lower this value, the stitch will be denser, and if you increase it, they will be looser. This density setting works well for my 40 weight thread. However, with a thinner thread, like a 60 weight, it might not be ideal. These things need to be tested. Or for a patch, where the satin stitch forms the edge of the design, you might need it to be denser. So you need to know how and where you intend to use the finished design, but this is a great starting point. Now, we need to set the pull compensation to 0.2mm again. We also use underlay for this stitch. With satin stitch, you have several options. One is the center walk underlay. If we check this box, it immediately shows that it will first sew a line down the center before starting the satin stitch. I'll uncheck this and let's move on. There's also contour underlay. If I check this box, it places the underlay along both edges like a track. With the default settings, you can see it's placed slightly inset from the edge of the satin stitch so it doesn't stick out underneath. The third option is zigzag underlay. If I check this, it places a zigzag stitch underneath. Our design is small right now and we don't want thick embroidery, so I'll choose the center walk underlay. Since I usually make designs for kids, my main priority is keeping the embroidery soft, not stiff or hard. I don't want a heavy shield on the fabric, so whenever possible, I try to minimize the required stitch count. That's why I prefer making applique designs, where fabric replaces the heavy stitching, leaving only the border and maybe a few accent details to embroider. That keeps the fabric softer. So I've selected the center walk underlay here. Let's go back to the satin column tab. So pull compensation is set to 0.2 millimeters. I'll come down here again and select trim after. It previews how it will look. And we click apply and quit. So now we've given the apple a satin border. Now let's select everything and see how it looks in the simulator. We go to extensions, ink stitch, visualize and export, simulator. Here it shows us again how it will embroider the design. It shows that it sews the apple first, then the leaf, then the stem, and as you can see, it added the border right at the very end. Of course, you could adjust it so it doesn't stitch the border over the stem and leaf if you don't want to, but that's not the main focus of this video. So our satin border is done. What about the leaf? Let's say we put a bean stitch along the edge of the leaf, which is another type of stitch. We already have a fill stitch for the leaf. I'll duplicate this as well. So clicking on the leaf, on the green layer, I right click and select duplicate. I'll hide the fill stitch for now. And I'll do the same thing as before. We need to remove the fill, right click, remove fill. Next, I hold down the shift key and pick a green colour for it. Let's say this green will look nicely. Let's check it, go to extensions, ink stitch, params. Since I don't want a satin stitch here, I don't need to convert it. In this case, the software defaults to a running stitch. It shows that it's stitching a simple outline. To turn this into a bean stitch, look at bean stitch number of repeats. They say 3, meaning a triple stitch, but in my experience, 3 is too much. It's too thick for me. For kids' clothes or smaller designs, 2 is plenty. The running stitch length is the actual length of each stitch. If my design is small, I lower the stitch length to 1.5 millimeters and the stitch tolerance to 0.1, so it follows curves more smoothly. But I'll leave it as it is for now. So I'll set this to 2. It might not be obvious, but as shown here, it's making repeating stitches. Trim after is already checked because we duplicated our existing fill stitch leaf, which already had it enabled. This looks good to me, so we apply and quit. Now, let's unhide what we did earlier. And let's see what happens in the simulator. We have our apple and we have our leaf. Now, this is where stitch ordering comes into play. Since the element on top is stitched last, it will embroider the leaf's bean stitch at the very end, which is fine. It can stay like this if you want it done at the end. However, if you want the bean stitch to be the exact same green as the fill stitch, It's better to place it right after the fill stitch so the machine completes them together. That way, you don't have to change threads, which is especially important for single needle machines, or if you simply prefer embroidering a specific element all at once. If they are two different colours, you can leave it as it is, since you'll need to swap threads anyway. The main point is that it shows the outline we just added. So we're done with that, let's close it. Now there's another option. What if I don't want to keep the stem as a fill stitch, but want to turn it into a full satin stitch instead? Not just giving it a border like the apple, but making the entire stem a satin column. In that case, here's what you do. Let's zoom in to get closer. I'll hide the apple, the leaf, and the borders for now so they don't get in the way. So now we're left with our stem. As you saw earlier, with the apple border, a satin stitch looks like a train track, and we know that we created an outline for that, which we then converted to satin. This time, we're converting a fill into a satin stitch. It's important to remember we generally don't use satin stitches for areas narrower than 1mm or wider than 7 to 8mm. Under 1mm, the stitches are so close together that they will punch holes right through the fabric. Above 7 to 8mm, you get very loose, long threads. Besides looking untidy, these snag on everything and will get torn up by buttons or zipper teeth in the washing machine. If someone wants a satin stitch on a wider element, they sometimes split it down to the middle into two joining satin columns. So there are workarounds, but the key is to keep these limits in mind. We can easily convert the apple stem into satin because it isn't too wide. So click on the pen tool to draw. I left click where I want to start drawing. This will be our starting point. I drag it where I want it to go. Where I want it to end, I left click again. That places a node there. To release the line, right click. Now we have a thick line, as thick as whatever setting we used last. We don't need it that thick, so I go to the fill and stroke tab and lower it to 0.1mm, which is plenty. Now I have one line here. This is a rung. To build the train track required for satin, the stem itself will act as the rails and these lines will serve as the rungs. These rungs control the direction of the stitches. Now we create the rails the same way. It's important that the rungs always extend beyond the shape, meaning they should be wider than the design element itself. So left click where I want to start, drag the line and left click to place it. Right click, again, left click, drag, left click. Even after releasing, the line tool is still active, which is why you right click to release it. Right click, left click, drag, release, right click, left click, drag, left click, right click, and with that, we've created the rails and rungs for it. Now I click back on the main select tool. Select everything, then go to extensions, ink stitch, tools, we select fill to satin. It immediately asks for the pull compensation amount. We can set it to 0.2mm. We can also specify that we want a center walk underlay. It asks if we want to preserve the original shape. It's often handy to keep it, so let's keep it and click apply. Close this window and go back to the layers panel. As you can see, both are visible now. Even the original brown fill we kept is still here. So we hide the brown fill layer, leaving us with this nice little track structure. Select it and go to Extensions, Ink Stitch, Params, and as you can see, it generates it beautifully. So we've successfully converted the fill into a satin stitch. The settings we specified are already applied, so we don't need to tweak much here, except maybe checking trim after at the bottom again. And with that, we're essentially done. We'll name this one Brown Satin. Now let's unhide the apple, the red fill. Unhide the leaf. We won't unhide the original brown stem layer because we built the satin stem to replace it, so that's no longer needed. Unhide the red satin border and unhide the green bean stitch as well. You could spend a lot of time fine-tuning these precisely to get the perfect stitching sequence, but for our first attempt, this is perfectly fine to see the differences between the stitch types and learn how to create them. Let's select everything again. Extensions, Ink Stitch, and check it in the simulator one more time. The apple is done, then the leaf, then the stem, as you can see. The leaf has its bean stitch and the apple has its satin border. So we've tested the most common stitch types using this apple design. At this point, if I'm happy with how everything looks, all that's left to do is save it. You can also group them if you like. We don't need these extra working files anymore. The original image is no longer needed, and if you don't plan to keep the stem as a fill stitch, you won't need the original brown fill shape either. Here you can name your file. Let's call it Apple. So let's save it. I'll save it right here in the Inkscape folder as Apple. Inkscape defaults to the SVG format, and we want to keep it there. You must save it as an SVG file first, because if you want to modify it later, change its size, adjust settings, add veins to the leaf, or anything else, once it's converted to an embroidery file, you won't be able to edit the paths anymore. That's why saving as SVG first is crucial. I've saved the file. Now I have an editable master file I can return to anytime. The design itself is ready. Of course, it's not perfect, details can and should be refined further, but it's great for testing. Now let's create an embroidery file from it. You can go to File, Export, specify the name, and select the extension. My personal preference is going to File, Save As. Since this is the finalized design, I'll save it in my Designs folder instead. I'll name it Apple here as well. However, I don't want SVG this time. Here is the list of file extensions where you can select what you need based on your specific embroidery machine. For my brother machine, it's PES. So I'll select PES and save it. And that creates your embroidery file. This is the file that goes to your machine. Now let me show you what I meant earlier about SVGs versus embroidery files. I'll open a new document, new from template, and I'll open a 4x4 inch hoop template. Let's open the file we just created. under Open Recent, we can find it right at the top. This time, I'm opening the PES file instead of the SVG file. This illustrates why saving as an SVG is so vital. When I open the PES file, you can see that you can no longer easily edit or tweak the individual parts. That's why always saving the SVG first is step 1. The SVG is your editable working copy, which you then export to the native file format your embroidery machine reads to stitch out the design. So, we've covered these essential stitch types. There are plenty more settings and fine details to pay attention to when making sure a design sits nicely on fabric, but today we directly tested fill stitch and satin stitch. We converted a fill shape completely into a satin column, and we even created a bean stitch contour. This covers the core fundamentals, and from here, you can experiment endlessly. To recap, fill stitch is generally used for covering large areas and backgrounds. Satin stitch is ideal for text, borders, stems, or highlighting smaller design elements. Bean stitch works best for outlines, hand-drawn effects, delicate details, or whenever a heavier satin stitch might overwhelm the design or look out of place. The most important takeaway of all is practice. Every fabric behaves differently, and your settings need to be adapted to the material you're stitching on. When I first started with machine embroidery, I used thin, old t-shirts for my test runs. Since embroidery needs stable fabric, I ordered heavier weight shirts for real projects. Assuming the thin ones would be fine for testing, I spent weeks tweaking settings on those thin shirts until everything looked perfect. But when I finally tried stitching on the thick t-shirt, it looked awful. I had wasted weeks testing on the wrong material and had to start from scratch. Always test your finalized designs on scrap pieces of the same exact fabric you plan to use for the final garment. Never do your very first test run on the actual item you want to keep. And finally, the most important piece of advice regarding tension: don't mess with your machine's thread tension unless absolutely necessary. In the previous video, I talked about puckering and basic settings. If you missed it, make sure to check that video out. So in this video, we've learned how to build an embroidery file from start to finish. I'll provide this embroidery file in several forms in the description so you can download and test it out. I'll also include the original Apple image so you can follow along with the conversion process yourselves. If you don't see the specific file format your machine needs, let me know in the comments. Here's a little challenge for you. The 1.5mm satin outline was chosen for a reason. If you'd like to try recreating this based on the video, try changing the satin outline width, setting to 2.5mm instead of 1.5mm. Let's see how yours turns out. Please leave a comment and let me know what machine you tested it out on and how it turned out. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe.